Wrap up protists. Now, remember we left off looking at groups of protists, right? We talked about, we were looking at the groups that are eukaryotes, right? And we'll be talking about plants, fungi, and animals. And you can see them labeled in this cladogram. And anything that's not labeled plant, animal, fungi is a protist, okay? And it's obviously not a good group because, and you can see it doesn't really form its own group. So a protist is something that is, it's got eukaryotic cells, it's got cells in the nuclei, but it's not a plant, not an animal, not a fungi. So if it's not a plant, animal, or fungi, and it's a eukaryotic cell, then it's a protist. And we left off talking about excavates, which are the oldest group. Then we looked at some examples of disky cristates, which include some pretty nasty parasites, like, for example, the one transmitted by the tsetse fly, which causes African sleeping sickness. And then someone actually asked me if there was a cure for this. And I forgot to mention something about this. So there is a drug you can take to deal with this. The problem with the drug, though, is that it's got a 10% mortality rate. Imagine taking a drug that will 1 in 10 chance of killing you. Would you take it? But exactly. The problem is the disease will kill you 100% of the time. Yeah, so I would take the chances. The problem with the drug, though, apparently, is you got to inject it in your veins, and the drug has antifreeze in it, which burns out your veins. It's very, very painful injections for a couple of weeks, and it's got a 10% chance of killing you. But again, the alternative is death. So we were talking about disky crit. So we talked about even the Chagas disease. So transmitted by a parasite that is very similar to the one that transmits African sleeping sickness. Here, by the way, is the life cycle of this parasite, Trypanosoma cruzi. Okay, but again, you don't have to worry about life cycles. I'm not going to test you on that. I want you to work on understanding characteristics of groups. Okay. So let's look at then the next group, the alveolates. Now this is a group that includes a very famous individual called a paramecium. Okay? And I believe that's one of your specimens in the slide set. Okay? Now, paramecium, so if you look at the key characteristic of this group, the key characteristic of this group, it says alveolates. They have flattened vesicles. Vesicles are like little sacs underneath the plasma membrane. Okay, so underneath the cell membrane, they have these flattened sac-like structures. Okay, which you can't even really see in this diagram. But what's really interesting about this group is something that they do, which is very bizarre. I'm going to explain it right now. So, remember, these guys can reproduce asexually, which means they can just make copies of themselves, or they can reproduce sexually. So here is an interesting thing that paramecium could do. Okay, so here are two paramecium that are going to come together for sexual reproduction. Okay, and you can see that they're different. One has this blue nuclei, and one has a red nuclei. Okay. So what they do when they want to undergo sexual reproduction is they take their nuclei and they copy it. Sorry, not copy. It undergoes, not copy it. Because it's a diploid nuclei. It says 2N. You know what 2N means? 2N means you have two sets of DNA. Okay. So in meiosis, the DNA gets cut in half. So what happens here is you have one round of meiosis that gives you two cells. And then you have another round of meiosis, which gives you 4 cells. You learned that in grade 9 or 10 science. 1 cell becomes 2, becomes 4. And then what happens is 3 out of the 4 cells deteriorate, so they disintegrate, so you lose them. And that 1 cell that's left over gets copied. So now you have 2 identical copies. The other paramecium is doing the exact same thing. What ends up happening then is you have these two are exactly the same. These two are exactly the same. And then they swap a pair. One of the two. Those, now remember, they're haploid, which means they only have one set of DNA. Okay? So they have one set of DNA each. So then they exchange them. Okay? So what ends up happening is this ends up becoming diploid again because each circle is an N. So N plus N is 2N. So originally we start off with a nuclei that has two sets of DNA, and you end up with a nuclei that has two sets of DNA, but you'll notice something. Now, the purple is just the color. What happened here? They ended up becoming identical to each other. Can you imagine that as a form of reproduction? You get together with someone, and then you come out to be identical to each other? That's pretty bizarre. Like, that's freaking weird, right? That's really weird. What's the point? Well, I guess it would be a form of sexual reproduction because you're mixing up the genomes, right? Well, or aren't you? Well, remember now, this paramecium can now split. It can now split and undergo asexual reproduction. Right. But what's the point of this sexual recombination? You get more variety. It's a way of generating variety. Now, we do something similar to this. You take an egg cell and a sperm cell and you put it together, right? Here they're actually taking each other and putting them together, if you think about it. And then splitting. It's an interesting form of reproduction where you end up becoming identical to your partner, which is weird, but it does produce variety. It's very weird. Okay, so this group also includes things like dinoflagellates, which are these creatures that are photosynthetic. So here's the thing. Don't assume that only plants are photosynthetic, because there are other things that are not plants that are photosynthetic. Here's a picture of red tide. I don't know if you can see the red in this picture. Okay, that's actually caused by dinoflagellates. If you see that, do not go in the water. That is extremely toxic. It's very, very dangerous. Yep. Photosynthetic is the ability to use sunlight to make food. Yeah. Malaria. You've heard of malaria? Okay, so malaria also, the parasite that causes malaria, Plasmodium vivax, there's a few of them, also belongs to this group. So this actually is an image of blood. These are the blood cells. So the parasite would actually get into these cells, and remember what they eat? Yeah, they eat the hemoglobin. Okay, so malaria is a protist. It belongs to the same group as paramecia and dinoflagellates. Then we have the group called the heteroconts. What does hetero mean? Hetero means different. So they have two different flagella, and that includes like the water mold. Okay, that includes the diatoms, although I can't really see the flagella in this image. So these are diatoms. So you have them in your slide set, right? And they look quite spectacular. Now, any of you want to be a forensic biologist?
I do.
Do you? No. You ever watch like CSI when they try to figure out how someone died and maybe where they died? Well, you could use diatoms to figure out where someone died because they're pretty specific. In other words, you know, if you're in this area and you drown, you would expect to see these types of diatoms in your system. If you're in another area and you drown, you would expect to see these types of diatoms in your system. So here's just some information about where diatoms are used in forensic science. to be able to determine whether or not someone was killed at this location, or whether or not they were killed somewhere else. So here's a case. It says 2 boys were fishing along the river when they were bound, beaten with a baseball bat, and attempted drowning by 3 other teenage boys. It's really bad, right? The boys escaped to go to report the attack. Forensic scientists took the clothes off the victims and the clothes off the suspects that the boys had identified. Samples taken from the clothing underwent diatom testing and then analyzed. The samples show that the ratios of algae populations from each sample were about 80% similar. So in other words, they were able to look at what was in the clothing to determine, yeah, these guys were actually at the same location where these boys were attacked. So that's quite interesting. Here's some more pictures of diatoms. Okay, this is golden algae. Okay, golden brown algae. So this also belongs. So the word term algae. Remember we defined it. Is that a good group or a bad group? Algae. Is that a good group or bad? It's not a good group, is it? Because look, so algae is not its own group. Okay. So like for example, brown algae is connected with water molds, and that includes diatoms too in that group. Okay. All right. Heteroconts includes, here's the brown algae, okay? So these guys can get quite large. Here's a kelp forest, okay? Now, plants. Right, that's one of the groups. Plants includes, so plants are not protists, okay, and there's going to be a whole other thing on plants. But they are defined by having a chloroplast with 2 membranes, and includes these 3 things. Land plants. So what would be an example of a land plant? It's a land plant. Yeah, and look outside, right? There's so many examples. Grass, apple tree, maple tree, right? Red algae and green algae. So these are not protists, okay? They're not protists. They're their own group, plants, right here, okay? So they're not protists. Okay. So here's a picture of red algae. You can see why it's called red algae. Okay. This is some pretty spectacular pictures. And then we have green algae. Okay. Recognize that? What does that look like? What does this look like to you? Starts with a V. Looks like it is Volvox. Volvox would fit into this category. Now, depending on how it was stained, it was going to look different, right? So green algae. So green algae, just like life, looks like animals evolved first in water, and then eventually some of them went onto land. It's the same story with land plants. The first plants were things like green algae, and then eventually we find land plants. Some of them some of the aquatic plants evolved to become land plants. So it's actually a very, very similar story. So, plants are things that use chlorophyll, capture sunlight. They use starch to store energy. They have cell walls made of cellulose. Okay. Here's a neat little picture of, this is actually conjugation, where algae are coming together and reproducing sexually. Okay. Then we have another group called the Amoebozoans. So this would be a protist, okay, because they're not plants, not animals, they're not fungi. So this is something that you have on your slide set, right? An amoeba. Now, one of the defining characteristics of an amoeba is it has no shape at all. This thing does not have a defined shape. You probably saw that on your slide set, that they all look very, very different. So here's an image of that. Okay. Plasmodial slime mold would also belong to this group, and so does cellular slime mold. Okay. Now, what defines an Amoebozoa? It says a naked amoeba with no pseudopods. That means they don't have an actual defined shape. Okay. There's no defined shape as you see with the other organisms. So we're actually almost done. We only have one group left. And the one group that's left are called the epistocons. So this is a very important group. Okay? Very important group. Why do you think it's an important group? Because look what it includes. Fungi and animals. This is a picture of a choanoflagellate colony. Okay? One of the defining characteristics is this thing right here. The cells have a collar with a flagella. Now, this picture is a picture of a sponge. Do you know what a sponge is? It's an animal. Sponge is an animal. What, yeah, so SpongeBob SquarePants would be an animal. One thing when we look at a sponge, we notice that we see a type of cell in the sponge that looks exactly the same as a choanoflagellate. A choanoflagellate is a protist, okay? But it's a protist that's very closely related to animals and fungi. So this last group includes fungi, animals, and choanoflagellates. So guess what? If you look at the cladogram, and it says that the closest kingdom to animals are fungi. That's really bizarre. Like if you put like a fungi, a plant, and an animal together, and you had an alien say, which two are most like each other? What would you predict? Why? Because people thought that. People thought fungi and plants are very closely related. Why would they think that? Yeah, they don't move. They grow off things like, plants grow out of the soil, mushrooms grow out of a substrate, but they don't move, right? And they look very, very similar. More similar to each other than they do look like animals, right? But when you look at the molecular biology, it's not the case. Fungi and animals are very closely related. They belong to a group called the epistocons, which include the choanoflagellates. Okay? And so that basically is, and again, the similarity is like molecular. Okay? It's a molecular similarity. You look at the DNA, you look at the RNA, you look at the proteins. That's what unites this group. It's not by appearance. Okay? Not by appearance at all. So that, ladies, is it for this presentation on protists, which include a little bit on animals and plants and fungi. Yep. Yes. Well, you should have them. Oh. All right. Well, that is the end.